we are already seeing green shoots when it comes to economic recovery.
Thanks to all of you for joining us for this webinar series. Over the last few months, the media has been abuzz with claims of rapid recovery and record growth for the Indian economy. There has also been claims that the pandemic-induced crisis is behind us and we are well on our way to pull the world's fastest growth this year. We heard the Prime Minister saying that our economy has recovered more strongly than it was halted by the pandemic. Though through this series, co-hosted by the Center for Financial Accountability and NewsClick, we intend to interrogate this idea of magic recovery that has been projected. We will try to question how much of such claims actually hold when confronted with the reality, how much of it is just a number game, what has recovery actually meant for the people, and what should a meaningful recovery actually look like. Today is the first session of the series, which is titled The Numbers Behind the Record Recovery. What are they showing and what do they hide? Following which, in the coming weeks, we would have on the 3rd of December another session of the series, where we will evaluate the government's proclaimed steps towards recovery. On the 6th of December, we will once again in another session joined by another set of panelists, we will discuss what has recovery actually meant for the people. And on the 10th of December, being the last session of the series, we will discuss what should have been a people-centric recovery and what it should have looked like, what it should have meant for the people. The series will be moderated by Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. He is a senior journalist, but that is just one of his many hats. His main areas of interest are the working of the political economy and the media in India and the world, on which he has written and also made documentary films. He is a writer, speaker, anchor, interviewer, and teacher. He has served as the editor of the Economic and Political Weekly. He has been a consultant with NewsClick. And we are thankful that he has agreed to anchor this series with us. Given the demagoguery and the high decibels in the newsrooms, we have been turned into a country that lives in short bursts and even shorter memories. The hardships of the lockdown, the complacency and the debacle of handling the second wave, the bodies floating in the rivers and the migrants on the streets are already being erased from public memory, while the economic policies are geared towards favoring big capital. In such a context, the series is a part of our efforts under Economy Per Charcha, aimed at allowing more public discussion around issues of finance that touch each of our pockets and our prospects. Without taking much more time, I hand over the stage to Paranjoy for his initial remarks, for introducing the panelists of the day and taking the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anirban. Thank you, everybody who's viewing this program. It is my honor and my privilege to be moderating this series of discussions, which examines the claims that are being made by the government on the economy. Before I introduce the three panelists who will be speaking on the subject, I'll give a broad overview of the theme, and we'll divide our conversation into three broad overlapping segments. In the first segment, we look at the numbers, we look at the claims that are being made, how credible are those claims. Thereafter, we look at certain specific issues, the policy prescriptions, and to what extent have they worked or not worked. And finally, we look ahead in the last segment. Now, what we see is that for a period of almost 3 years, the rate of growth of India's gross domestic product had been steadily decelerating. And it came down to a low that was really a 42-year-old low. Our GDP growth figures, I'm talking about nominal rate of growth of gross domestic product. It came down to a 42-year low in January 2020. Thereafter came the sudden lockdown, and the government's own figures tell you what kind of impact it had. I mean, those figures are certainly questionable, and they will surely be questionable, but even what the government has claimed is significant. In the first quarter of financial year 2021, that is the months of April, May, and June 2020, the rate of India's GDP, India's gross domestic product, actually shrunk. Arguably for the first time in the history of this country, by almost 24%. Never before has the Indian economy shrunk. And then we entered into what the Americans called a phase of technical recession, because in the next quarter, that is July, August, September, the economy shrank, according to the government, by 7.5%. The point is that what we know, and this is for very, 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 very sure, that these numbers have to be seen in a certain context. Economists often talk about the low base effect, and I'm sure the speakers will be explaining these in greater detail. But before I come to the speakers, let me quickly tell you what the government is claiming. The government is claiming that India's rate of growth of GDP has rebounded in the first quarter of the current financial year, that is the months of April, May, and June 2021, with a record growth, quote unquote, record growth of 20.1%. For the entire financial year, which will end at the end of March of 2022, various estimates are there. There are estimates made by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and of course others as well. But those numbers vary from 9% to 10%. And it is argued that this will be double the rate of growth of world GDP, global GDP, double that of the United States of America, and about 1.5 to 2 percentage points above the projected rate of growth of China. Will this really materialize is another question that our panelists will look into. Now, the Reserve Bank of India, as well as the government of India, I mean, they are both making certain claims, but there's a slight difference in the claims. The Reserve Bank of India estimates GDP growth to be 9.5%, and the government of India is saying it's closer to 10%. And the Finance Ministry has been claiming that India is on its way to becoming the fastest growing major economy in the world. Now, what this means, if you are the fastest growing, and what are its implications on various sectors of the economy, the social sector, healthcare, education, the infrastructure, and looking at employment. These are some of the issues that our panelists will be dealing with. Let me quickly introduce them. They are all eminent economists in their own right. We are very happy to have with us Professor Surajit Das. He'll be the first speaker. He's an assistant professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has in the past worked with the Planning Commission, the Finance Commission, and he's looks at macroeconomic trends very carefully and from a pro-people perspective, I understand. With us here is Professor Dipa Sinha. She is an assistant professor at the School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University in Delhi. And over the years, she's been actively involved in the Right to Food campaign, and she is immersed deeply into issues of nutrition and food security. She'll be the second speaker. And she'll be the third speaker. The second speaker will be, I beg your pardon, Professor Shatuki Roy. He's an associate professor at the ISID, the Institute for Studies in Industrial Development. And he has written on various economic issues but a lot of his work has been focused on labor and employment and structural changes, looking at emerging trends in the manufacturing sector, human development, and the political economy of informality. So let us start. We'll ask each of the speakers to speak for approximately 10 minutes, and we'll first examine the veracity or the credibility of the numbers that have been put. And then we'll also ask them to look at the claims that are being made. The claims that are being made are pretty. I mean, I'll give you one example. Here is the Prime Minister saying that COVID-19 affected the economies of the entire world, including that of India. But our economy has recovered more strongly than it was halted by the pandemic. Is this correct? How correct? Prime Minister Narendra Modi also says, when big economies of the world were busy defending themselves during the pandemic, we were carrying out reforms. Later in the discussion, towards the end of the discussion, we are going to look at what these reforms were. The Prime Minister talks about global supply chains. When global supply chains were disrupted, we introduced the PLI, the Production Linked Incentive Scheme, and to turn new opportunities in favor of India. And Mr. Modi finally says, we should look upon ourselves as the global economic leader, as in the 21st century, India does not have a scarcity of opportunities to make it big. So that's it. I stop now. I've spoken quite a lot, more than I perhaps should have. We are going to look at other specific issues, and I'm sure the panelists will talk about it, private consumption demand, look at corporate tax cuts, and so on and so forth. So let's start with you, Shurajit.
Thanks a lot, Paranjoy, sir. And at the outset, I must thank Center for Financial Accountability and NewsClick for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this. Number one is the credibility of the numbers. As far as I am concerned, in my opinion, the numbers which have been officially announced are as credible as they were earlier. So, I mean, there should not be any confusion. Of course, these numbers have a lot of limitations. We know that these are quarterly estimates, and our GDP, if we can broadly divide our GDP in three sectors, major sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. Then on agricultural sector, we get data twice in a year, Rabi season and Kharif season. Industry data, reliable industry data comes only once in a year, that is annual survey of industry is the source. And service sector data, reliable data is collected once in 5 years through economic census. And in between, and it is important to mention here that service sector is more than 50% of our GDP. So even annual GDP numbers have their own limitations, and as far as the quarterly numbers are concerned, there are some high frequency data based on which the Central Statistical Office, nowadays it is called NSO, National Statistical Office, they make some projections. So most of the economists, particularly macroeconomists, they don't take these quarterly numbers seriously. There are a lot of limitations. However, when the actual data arrives, when the first revised estimate takes place, then second revised estimate takes place, then actual figures are available almost after 2 years from from the current situation, from the current days. So if I say today that 2018-19 GDP numbers are more reliable than the numbers which have been projected by NSO for last year or for first quarter of this year, then nobody would take interest in the GDP numbers of 2018-19. However, I mean, those numbers are the reliable numbers. Quarterly estimates and also the first revised estimates or the provisional estimates of annual GDP numbers have got their own limitations. Having said so, I must tell you that GDP numbers per se, I mean, these numbers may or may not reflect the reality, depending on our perception of the reality. But these are the best available information that we have as far as the macroeconomic situation is concerned. So if numbers are bad, they were bad earlier also. If numbers are good, they are good now also. uh, so the credibility of the numbers didn't suddenly go down probably during the this lockdown or pandemic. The second point which I want to make is not only in India, the lockdown has happened all over the globe. We know all the countries have been affected. The GDP growth rate have come down, and all the economies have more or less suffered. And the recovery rate also varies widely, country to country, economy to economy. Uh, as far as the first quarter data of this financial year is concerned, the CSO says the growth rate would be around 19% in the first quarter, as compared to the first quarter of last year when the growth rate was minus 24%. Now, Paranjoy sir was talking about low base effect. I must tell you what it is. It's basically uh, if GDP happens to be 100 crore rupees, and if it falls by 25%, then it would become 75 crore rupees. Okay. Now, after that, if there is 25% growth, instead of minus 25%, if there is positive 25% growth, then GDP does not come back to 100. It would be lower than 100. To reach to 100 again, we need 33.3% growth, not 25% growth. So that's the because of the low base effect. So even if after minus 24% growth of the first quarter in the last financial year, even if we would have had plus 25% growth this year in the first quarter, then also our GDP would not have become what it was before lockdown. So there is no question that this I mean the recovery has been complete, or recovery has taken place in or as Paranjoy was saying, reportedly, that there is a claim that actually our recovery was higher than the negative shock that the economy faced due to lockdown during the first quarter of last financial year. So it is yet to recover. Now, recovery can be seen in two ways, in my opinion. One is the level of activity, or the GDP, or if you like, gross value added of a country, that whether that has become equal to what it was before lockdown, that can be called recovery. The other way of looking at it is what our growth rate used to be before lockdown. Uh, it came down, as Paranjay sir was telling, that it was decelerating. It became almost 4% in 2019-20, from 6% in 18-19, and before that it was even higher. So if we have to go back to our 5 to 6% growth rate, which was usual before lockdown, then the recovery would mean something else. So recovery of the growth rate and recovery of the GDP, or the gross domestic product, or the level of activity, are two different things. Now, even if the growth rate remains 0%, that means the level of activity remains the same. So that can be called recovery. But I would like to argue that by recovery, I would mean, particularly in the context of Indian economy, if we can go back to our usual growth path of 5 to 6% of growth, annual growth at least. So that is, as of now, it is looking like a far-reaching goal. For the time being, we can maximum hope that in this year probably the growth we can achieve a 0% growth rate as compared to the GDP of 2019-20, that is before lockdown GDP. But nobody is even hoping that there would be a positive growth rate of 5 to 6% over what our GDP was in 2019-20 before lockdown. For that, I mean, in the next session, probably next section of the discussion, probably we will take it up, that what could have been done, what should have been done, what has been done as compared to that, and how to expedite the process of recovery and how to reach back to our usual growth path sooner than the later.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shurajit, for that your initial remarks and the overview you've given. Let me come to Shatuki. And I'll just add a few points to what I already mentioned. The pandemic, there is evidence to indicate that large numbers of Indians were pushed into poverty. They may have been a little above the poverty line. We can again discuss what is the poverty line, how do you define it, but the point is their economic condition deteriorated and they were pushed into poverty. One number that I have is there were about 33 crore, 330 million Indians who were pushed into poverty. We also have a lot of evidence to indicate that the inequality of income and wealth grew. The super rich, the oligarchs, their notional wealth grew in this period. Having said that, there are also indications that there is a resumption of the manufacturing activity, relative improvement of the service sector, uptake in power consumption. But as Shurajit was saying, is it too early to start celebrating? And especially we want to look at what is really a meaningful recovery and really the crucial factors that should cause us concern. And here I'll just flag 2 points. One is the issue of employment, and I'm sure you will tell us in greater detail what the data of the government. We don't have much data of the government, so we have to depend on data of the CMIE, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. And also, if you could talk a little bit about the disturbingly low consumer demand that is happening. Private consumption demand, which is one of the important drivers of growth, is back to its level that was in 2017-18. So we know households are not spending aggressively. There have been job losses, higher expenses on healthcare, energy. So these are some of the additional points I would like you perhaps to add, and I'm sure Dipa will be also able to add on some of these points. Please, over to you, Professor Shatuki Roy.
Okay. Thank you, Paranjoy. So, taking off from what Surajit has already mentioned, I will add some of the figures because the claim is that the recovery is record in the sense that which is factually correct if one says, because if you compare the data of quarter ending June of 2021 22 with 2021, then the growth is about 20.1%, which is perhaps the highest in India comparing quarterly estimates, since when the whole quarterly estimates figures were issued from 1996. So this is the highest growth if you see comparing quarterly estimates of 2 years. But it is also true that if you compare the quarterly estimates of quarter ending June, first quarter of 21-22, with quarter ending June of 2019-20, then we will find out that what actually happened. Because the contraction between the first quarter of 1920 and 2021 was roughly 24.4%. So in the previous year, if you use the quarterly estimates and find out the level of contraction, then it was 24.4%. And when you are comparing quarterly estimates of first quarter of 21-22 with respect to 2021, then there is a growth of 20.1%. So first of all, the amount of contraction that happened has not been taken care of by the growth which has been projected, although Reserve Bank of India is also saying that the growth figures need to be upscaled in the second and third quarter. Now coming to the question of where actually we need to see, because this is quite normal that when the economy dips because of some abnormal situation like pandemic or something, there would be a contraction which would be huge. And at the same time, when situation eases off and when business as usual are restored, people go to their work, factories are opened, agricultural activities are once again restored, and all these things happen, it is quite natural that there would be a rebouncing. There is nothing abnormal about that. But the point is, we need to see whether we have come back to 2019 scenario or not, which is the pre-pandemic scenario. And I'm saying that, of course, the government is claiming that there is a V-shaped recovery and very fast record kind of recovery is happening. Let us read the economic survey of the same government, what they actually told in the economic survey. In the past economic survey, assessing the situation of COVID-19 and its impact in the economy, the government suggests, or the survey suggested, that if the 6.7% growth rate, which is the 5-year average in the pre-pandemic scenario, if that continued, then in 2023-24, we could have reached a certain GDP, which was basically disturbed because of the pandemic. And now the economic survey suggests that if we have 10% growth rate in 2021, followed by 6 to 7% growth rate in 21-22 and 23-24, then also the GDP that we will achieve at the end of 23-24 financial year would be 90% short of what we could have achieved if the trend growth rate was continuing. So it is easy to say using a year-to-year comparison between both in case of contraction and both in case of recovery. It is not actually very prudent to arrive at some conclusion on the basis of these figures. Because as Surajit has mentioned, and you also have mentioned in the initial introduction, that when we talk about low base, if the economy falls from 100 to 2 and then it grows up to 4, then it is 100% growth rate. But if it grows from 100 to 102, then it is only 2% growth rate. So just looking into those year-to-year figures would not give us the answer. Now, comparing the figures of 21-22 first quarter with 2019, which is the pre-pandemic scenario, what do we get? We get, first of all, that in case of private final consumption expenditure, the level is 11.9% lower than what it was in 2019-20 first quarter. Gross fixed capital formation is 17.1% lower than what it was in the first quarter of 19-20. Only where we see some positive recovery, in the sense that where the growth rate is probably recovering at a level which was in 2019-20 first quarter, which is exports. We find 8.7% positive growth rate during this quarter. Coming to manufacturing, if you see in manufacturing sector, the gross value added after the first quarter of 21-22, the figures that we receive, it is 4.2% lower than what it was in the first quarter in the pre-pandemic situation in 2019-20. Only sector that recovered and reached a level probably in the level what it was in the pre-pandemic scenario is the utilities, which is electricity, gas, and water. So all the sectors what we see are basically showing some activity growth during this period. But if you compare with the pre-pandemic scenario, most of the sectors have not actually reached the level what it was in 2019. Now, coming to the employment scenario, I will make some comments regarding sectors, and later on I would come to the nature of employment that has increased. Precarity has increased during this period of time. Now, of course, there is a reversal. If you compare the PLFS of 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, periodic labor force survey, then what it shows that during the period 1920, there is a reversal of employment from non-agriculture to agriculture. The share of employment in agriculture has increased. And this is primarily because of the component or the increase of what we can say of farm laborers, not the farmers. So the people who are working in construction sector and other non-farm activities are back to villages and relying on agricultural activities. If you consider non-agriculture, which is manufacturing, one can see that the figures were that in 2019, in the pre-pandemic scenario, total 40 million people were employed in manufacturing sector as a whole, 40 million. Now this came down to almost half, to 21 million in April 2020, which is understandable, and that is because of the pandemic. It picked up to 30 million in 2021 February. So in February, it has recovered to 30 million. Now the latest figure of CMI, which says that it has again fallen back to 28 million in August 2021. And those who are doing industry studies, they see that there is a hysteresis, the effect of continuing with the same employment level is there, because already the employers are taking resort to other kinds of productive activities which employ less employment. So whether Indian manufacturing sector would go back to the 40 million employment in manufacturing to its pre-pandemic level or not is not very sure, at least the way the growth is taking up. So what I would say that these facts basically suggest that of course there is a tendency which is quite normal, that once situations ease out, then there would be activity levels increasing. It has its effect on the economy as well. But it is, by saying that it is a record recovery, it is nothing but one can say that infantile jubilance, because you are basically using the low base and trying to claim that something is happening which is very great. My final point in this regard, because you mentioned about the kind of inequality and other kinds of tendencies that are visible, because this debate is also there, that this is a K-shaped kind of recovery. What we see, that 35% increase in the wealth of billionaires during this period of time, during the pandemic. And if you go through the figures of listed companies of non-financial sectors, we will find that this is the period when the growth of reserves and surplus, it grew by around 15%, which is a record level in the past decade. And most of these corporates, you see that the debt to credit ratio as well as the gearing ratio has declined during this period of time because they have enough surplus. So this is the time when Mukesh Ambani became the 4th richest person in the world, and his earnings during the pandemic was about 90 crore rupees per hour, when 1/4 of the Indian population was earning less than 3,000 rupees per month. So here I end, and perhaps later on we'll take up more issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shaktuki Roy, for giving us your views. That was an excellent overview you gave. और दीपा जी, आपके पास मैं आ रहा हूं इस वक्त। हमारे जो अर्थशास्त्री बारीकी से समझाया किस तरह से भारत सरकार का जो आंकड़ा है हमारे जीडीपी यानी कि सकल घरेलू उत्पाद, इसका आंकड़ा के ऊपर बहुत सारे सवाल उठाना जरूरी है। इसका विश्वसनीयता के ऊपर बहुत सारे सवाल इन्होंने उठाया, और साथ साथ इन्होंने कहा कि जिस तरह से रोजगार का जो समस्या है, और मैं एक चीज और आपको कहना चाहता हूं, जिस तरह से हमने देखा प्रवासी मजदूर शहर छोड़ के गांव में गए हैं, भारतवर्ष का इतिहास, विश्व के इतिहास में हमने शायद इस तरह के करोड़ों लोग का पलायन हमने नहीं देखा। इस विषय के ऊपर सरकार तो ज्यादा कुछ कहने नहीं चाहते हैं, मगर ये जो बेरोजगारी का समस्या, महंगाई का समस्या, और साथ साथ आप जैसे जिस विषय के ऊपर आपका विषय, आपने काफी इस विषय के ऊपर आपने पढ़ाई किया, आपने ये जो छोटे छोटे कारोबार तो खत्म हो गए बहुत सारे। हम देख रहे ये जिस हड़बड़ी से जीएसटी, गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज टैक्स को लागू किया गया, हम देखा किस तरह से 5 साल पहले नोटबंदी जिस तरह से किया, और खाद्य सुरक्षा और सार्वजनिक जो शिक्षा का व्यवस्था, स्वास्थ्य का व्यवस्था, ये सारे विषय के ऊपर आपका राय हमारे दर्शक जरूर सुनने चाहेंगे। और प्रधानमंत्री तो उनका जो प्रधानमंत्री का जो किसान का जो योजना है, जो खाद्यान्न मुफ्त में दे रहे, तो मार्च तक उन्होंने आगे बढ़ा दिया और हाँ, तब तक उत्तर प्रदेश का चुनाव भी खत्म हो जाएगा। तो आपका राय क्या है कि सामाजिक क्षेत्र में शिक्षा, स्वास्थ्य, महिलाओं की स्थिति, रोजगार, छोटे छोटे कारोबार, इसके ऊपर सरकार का आंकड़ा के बारे में और आपका राय जरूर दीजिए।
जी धन्यवाद। पहली बात तो आपने इस बात से खत्म किया कि सरकार के आंकड़ों के बारे में बताएं। ये सारे मुद्दे जिनको आपने अभी गिनाया, बहुत सारी चीजों पर कोई सरकार के आंकड़े है ही नहीं, और ये बहुत फायदामंद है क्योंकि जब आंकड़े हैं ही नहीं तो कोई भी कुछ भी कह सकता है और वो रिकॉर्ड बन जाता है, और वो हम देख रहे हैं। जो आंकड़े हैं उसको भी गलत तरीके से समझा जा रहा है। ये हमारे पिछले दोनों वक्ताओं ने काफी अच्छे से समझाया कि ये जो रिकॉर्ड रिकवरी की बात हो रही है कि 20% एक क्वार्टर में वृद्धि हो गई, वो अगर हम उसके पिछले साल के तुलना में देखें जहां पे 24% कम हुई, तो वो एक्चुअली वृद्धि नहीं है, हम और भी पीछे ही हैं। जो 2 साल से पहले के स्तर पे थे वहां तक भी नहीं पहुंचे। तो इसको तो पहले समझने की बहुत जरूरत, ये बहुत जरूरी है जो दोनों पिछले वक्ताओं ने बोला, दैट दिस heightened rate of growth has the low base effect that they spoke about, that you need even much higher growth rate to even come back to the level at which we were. But जैसे आपने सवाल पूछे, मैं ग्रोथ से थोड़ा आगे बढ़ना चाहती हूँ कि एक तो पहली बात यह है कि आर्थिक वृद्धि भी जिस तरह से कह रहे हैं वो हो नहीं रहा है। लेकिन अगर हम रिकवरी का बात करें तो किस चीज में रिकवरी, किसकी आर्थिक व्यवस्था है ये, और इसमें कौन लोग हैं, और किसकी आमदनी बढ़ेगी तो हम कहेंगे कि आर्थिक वृद्धि हो रही है। क्योंकि हम कई सालों से देख रहे हैं, और ये पैंडेमिक के बाद और भी बढ़ गया है, कि असमानता जो है वो बढ़ते जा रहा है। तो एक तरफ वृद्धि हो भी रही है, लेकिन दूसरी तरफ सैकड़ों ऐसे लोग हैं जिनके अपने घर में, अपने परिवार में आमदनी जो आता है वो उस दर से नहीं बढ़ रहा है, और बहुत ऐसे लोग हैं जिनका बिल्कुल बढ़ ही नहीं रहा है। Even before the pandemic, we know that the last 3-4 years, post demonetization, GST and so on, rural wages, for instance, have been stagnant. Real wages in rural areas did not increase at all for 3-4 years. और फिर पैंडेमिक के बाद भी हम लोग देख रहे हैं कि ग्रामीण इलाकों में जो वेज मिलता है वो अगर हम दामों के साथ एडजस्ट करें, रियल टर्म्स में देखें, तो उस पर कोई बढ़ोतरी, वो बढ़ा ही नहीं है पिछले 3-4 साल में। और ये कोरोना के महामारी के बाद तो और भी बिल्कुल वो घटने लगा है। तो पहली बात तो अगर हम वेजेस देखें कि लोग कितना कमा पा रहे हैं अपने मेहनत के लिए, उसमें कोई वृद्धि नहीं आई है, और ये पैंडेमिक के बाद घट गया है। तो इसको हम बिल्कुल किसी भी तरह से हम लोग इसको रिकवरी तो नहीं कह सकते। दूसरी बात जो अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट, बेरोजगारी की बात की गई है, वंस अगेन इट्स वेरी अनइवन इन द सेंस कि कौन सी नौकरियां हैं जो गई हैं। वो नौकरियां सबसे पहले गई जो असंगठित क्षेत्र में थे, जो ऐसे लोग करते थे जो दिहाड़ी पे काम करते थे, जिनके पास कोई सेविंग्स नहीं थे। और हम अभी भी देख रहे हैं, अभी दूसरी लहर के बाद बहुत सारे फील्ड सर्विस नहीं हुए हैं, लेकिन जो पहली लहर के बाद पिछले साल 2020 के अंत में जो कुछ फील्ड सर्वे हुए, अजीम प्रेमजी यूनिवर्सिटी ने किया, हमारे राइट टू फूड कैंपेन ने भी किया, ये सारे सर्वेज ने दिखाया कि दिसंबर जनवरी के पीरियड में ऑलरेडी लगभग 2/3 लोग कह रहे थे कि एक सिंपल इंडिकेटर अगर हम लोग ले लें कि खाद्य सुरक्षा का, कि क्या आप जो खा रहे हैं वो मात्रा में महामारी से पहले के तुलने में ज्यादा है कि कम है। ये सवाल जब पूछा गया अलग अलग सर्वेस में, 60% से ज्यादा लोगों ने कहा कि महामारी के बाद खाने का मात्रा कम हो गया है। एंड दिस इज नॉट ड्यूरिंग द नेशनल लॉकडाउन, दिस इज 6 months आफ्टर द लॉकडाउन एंडेड। और इसमें फिर जब हम डिटेल में जाते हैं, हम देखते हैं कि व्हाट आर द काइंड्स ऑफ थिंग्स दैट पीपल स्टॉप ईटिंग पल्सेस or reduce the quantity of pulses, of oil, of eggs, of vegetables, of fruits and so on. Now, जो दूसरी लहर आई उसके बाद हमने, जैसे दिल्ली में मैंने बहुत सारे इलाकों में काम किया है दूसरी लहर, और उसके बाद हम देख रहे हैं कि बहुत सारे ऐसे परिवार जो पहले लहर के बाद थोड़ा बहुत ठीक थे, संभल गए थे, अपने आप आगे बढ़ रहे थे, वैसे परिवार भी गरीबी में आ गए दूसरी लहर के बाद, क्योंकि उनके पास जो थोड़े बहुत सेविंग्स बचे थे कुछ लोगों के, उसका भी खर्चा हो गया। नॉट जस्ट क्योंकि कर्फ्यू और लॉकडाउन था, काम कम हो गया, लेकिन साथ साथ दूसरे लहर में स्वास्थ्य पे खर्चा भी बढ़ गया, और इसका भी हमारे पास कोई आंकड़ा नहीं है। बस हम ये जानते हैं कि बहुत सारे अस्पतालों में बहुत वसूली तो हुई है जब लोग बीमार पड़े हैं, दवाइयां नहीं मिल रही थी, ब्लैक में लोग खरीद रहे थे, ऑक्सीजन खरीद रहे थे, और ये सबसे भी लोगों पर असर पड़ा है। तो एक है कि ग्रोथ उतना हुआ नहीं है, दूसरा बेरोजगारी है, तीसरा जिनको काम मिल भी रहा है उनको दो चीजें हम लोग देख रहे हैं। पहली चीज जैसे मैंने कहा, जो वेजेस मिल रहे हैं वो कम मिल रहे हैं, और दूसरा चीज जितना दिन काम मिलता था उतने दिन काम नहीं मिल रहा है। जैसे हफ्ते में लोग कह रहे हैं कि अगर रोज हम लोग जाते हैं काम ढूंढने तो हो सकता है एक दिन दो दिन हमें काम मिल जाता है। तो ऐसे लोगों को हम लोग अपने बेरोजगारी के आंकड़ों में नहीं गिनते, लेकिन क्योंकि उनको कुछ ना कुछ तो काम मिल रहा है, लेकिन वो काम जितना काम मिल रहा है वो भी घट गया है, और इसका भी आंकड़े अभी अगर पीएलएफएस अगला राउंड जब आएगा शायद हम लोग थोड़ा बहुत देख पाएंगे। इसके साथ साथ एक और चीज मुद्दा जिस पर बात नहीं हुआ, अगेन व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट रिकवरी एंड स्पेशली इट्स इम्पैक्ट ऑन the poor and those who live in the lower quintiles, is the issue of inflation. दूसरी लहर के बाद हम जो दामों में बड़ा इंक्रीज आया है वो भी हम लोग देखने लगे हैं। एंड इट इज ट्रू कि फूड इन्फ्लेशन मतलब सीपीआई, अगर कंज्यूमर प्राइस इन्फ्लेशन आप लोग देखो तो उतना बढ़ा नहीं है, लेकिन आप एक एक कमोडिटी पे जाए, जैसे पेट्रोल का दाम कितना बढ़ा है ये हम सब लोग जानते हैं, एंड दिस इम्पैक्ट्स द एंटायर हाउस होल्ड बजट इन सो मेनी वेज। जैसे वन सेक्टर दैट इज शोन वेरी पॉजिटिवली कि इससे बहुत फायदा हुआ, जो गिग वर्कर्स है, जो स्विगी जोमैटो वगैरह, अगर आप इन वर्कर्स से बात करें उनसे तो कुछ अलग ही कहानी मिलती है कि उनकी रेट कार्ड तो कम हो गई इस समय में, उसके साथ साथ पेट्रोल का दाम बढ़ गया तो वो एक्चुअली जितना कमा रहे हैं वो तो आधा हो गया है। इस तरह से अलग अलग सेक्टर में दामों का असर पड़ा है। ऑल्सो जो मैं कह रही थी कि जिस तरह का खाने के पदार्थ लोग कम किए हैं उन चीजों का दाम और भी बढ़ गया। खाने का तेल, फॉर इंस्टेंस, edible oils prices have really increased in this period. So overall, I would like to मतलब इस सेक्शन को कंक्लूड करते हुए कि when we talk about recovery, I think it's what Paranjoy you also said in your introductory remarks. We really need to interrogate if it's a meaningful recovery. जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट ये परसेंट वो परसेंट कुछ ना कुछ होते रहेगा, उसमें भी बहुत सारे खामियां हैं जैसे हमने बात किया, लेकिन अगर वो ग्रोथ रेट हो भी जाए, वो ग्रोथ किसके लिए ग्रोथ है और एक्चुअली लोगों के जिंदगियों पर क्या असर पड़ रहा है उसको भी हमें साथ साथ पूछने का जरूरत है। उसमें हम देख रहे हैं कि जरूर असमानता बढ़ रहा है, एंड देयर आर मेनी इंडिकेटर्स लाइक द अजीम प्रेम जी estimate that 230 million people fell into poverty post the first wave. Again, that's before the second wave, where they look at the minimum wage as the poverty line. या अभी रिसेंटली सरकार ने कुछ ही महीने पहले ये अनऑर्गेनाइज्ड वर्कर्स का ई श्रम पोर्टल शुरू किया, जिसमें असंगठित क्षेत्र के मजदूर अपने आप को रजिस्टर कर सकते हैं। उस पोर्टल में 2 महीना पहले जो 5.5 करोड़ लोगों ने रजिस्टर किया, उस डेटा के हिसाब से 92%, 92% ऑफ द वर्कर्स हु रजिस्टर्ड ऑन द ई श्रम पोर्टल वर अर्निंग लेस देन 10,000 rupees a month. I think that one also is enough for us to ask what kind of recovery we are talking about. So I'll end my comments on the first round.
धन्यवाद दीपा जी। आपने हमारे सुरजीत जी और सात्विक जी जो कहा उसके आपने ये महंगाई का जो समस्या है, जो दिहाड़ी मजदूरों का जो समस्या है, छोटे छोटे व्यापारियों को और जो असंगठित क्षेत्र में लोगों का समस्या के बारे में आपने हमारी जो बातचीत चल रही है इसके ऊपर काफी बहुत सारे मुद्दा आपने जोड़ दिया। If we come now to the second section of our discussion, and I'll go in more or less I'll go in the same order that I did. What was the government's reaction? Faced with mounting criticism that the government was not doing enough, not spending enough, we saw Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman announce a slew of schemes. And this was in really the middle of 2020. Now, when people looked at those schemes very carefully, it was all very fine for her to say it adds up to 10% of our GDP, 20 lakh crores. Sounds very, very impressive. But when people started breaking down those numbers, you find that 90, or certainly about 90% of that were repackaged schemes. The same scheme being repeated in terms of additionality. It was barely 10%. So instead of 20 lakh crores, the so-called stimulus package should have been actually 2 lakh crores or thereabouts, or maybe a little more than that. Now, the government's reluctance to spend has been sort of made out as if it's some sort of a virtue. And I'll give you a few quotes, and I'd like all three of you to react to what was said. In the month of November, the spokesperson of the Bharatiya Janata Party on economic matters, that is Gopal Krishna Agarwal, he said that the biggest risk to the global economy as well as the Indian economy was what he said, premature hardening of interest rates on account of inflationary pressures. And then he said India's handling of the economy was much better than other countries, which resorted to printing money, distributing cash doles. And this is the exact words he used. We did not resort to uncontrolled deficit financing, fiscal deficit financing. Our government followed prudent economic policies in spite of intense pressure. Mr. Modi's government followed a calibrated approach in its economic response with staggered fiscal stimuli and focused on targeted delivery through DBT, direct benefit transfer. We also see some other economists. I mean, for instance, Ruchir Sharma, the chief global strategist for Morgan Stanley. He published a report which he says that countries which were quote unquote heavy spenders, and in his opinion, reckless spenders, their recovery was relatively poor. And countries that, in his words, spend wisely and spread their efforts in managing the pandemic, they did better in terms of growth. So Mr. Modi, according to them, did not randomly spend or distribute cash, but spread its efforts in reaching the poorest through targeted cash transfers, giving them food, developing vaccines, ramping up the health infrastructure, etc., etc. This is not what I'm saying. I'm merely quoting the spokesperson of the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Gopal Agarwal, and Ruchir Sharma of Morgan Stanley. So, Shurajit, if we can start with you. Will you like to comment on the government's reaction and the way it reacted?
Yes, I don't know whether I would be able to react exactly to these comments made by spokesperson of some political party or not. But let me react to these claims in general. I mean, briefly, I want to mention that we were also carrying out one telephonic survey with the help of our friends in 15 states, and I don't want to discuss the results in detail now. I mean, in some other occasion we can do that. However, we have surveyed around 3,150 households comprising of around 14,500 people during the lockdown, and according to our results, 46% of the households lost their entire income during the lockdown, and around 50% of the households have become indebted. Others could manage with their past savings, and because the expenditure could not come down proportionately as the income fell because of the lockdown. And also there were extreme vulnerability in the mind of people about the future stream of income. Everything was uncertain. People were hit disproportionately. We know the burden of the lockdown fell primarily on the poor rather than the rich, and as a result of that, there was unprecedented misery. And I was afraid of a large scale widespread famine in this country initially. However, that could be avoided probably because of two major central sector schemes. One is public distribution system, second is Mahatma Gandhi employment, national employment guarantee scheme. So people have got some relief at least, so that famine could be avoided. But the situation at the ground level, as far as our survey is concerned, is uh, uh, extremely miserable. So having said so, uh, you have mentioned about Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhijan package, and before that there was this Garib Kalyan package, which was incorporated later on within the Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhijan package. Out of this 20 lakh crore package, you are rightly putting it that hardly 1% of GDP, which is around 2 lakh crore rupees of the package, would be the financial commitments of the government. All others were either in terms of liquidity infusion or some measures which were taken by the Reserve Bank of India in order to enable banks and the financial system to deliver more loans, and so on and so forth. 75% of the package was all about that. I remember I wrote one paper during that time, that if you look at the uh, credit deposit ratio of all the commercial banks in India taken together, that was continuously falling since the lockdown was announced in March 2020. And it even after the announcement of Atmanirbhar Bharat package, even after giving MSMEs and farmers lot of incentives to borrow money from the financial sector at easier terms, at a lower rate of interest, with government guarantee, without any collateral, etc., the credit deposit ratio did not pick up. So the investment rate in the economy was not picking up simply because of the fact that there was not profitable opportunity in the market, and vast majority of the masses, they have lost their income. As a result of that, their consumption demand came down, and as consumption demand comes down, it reduces the demand for almost all industries, and obviously market is down. It is not a good time to invest, and investors should not take the risk of investing more money now in this kind of a depressing situation. So that is and as a result, and that time many of us were actually arguing that the fiscal policy, expansionary Keynesian demand management policy, is the way out to get rid of this kind of a problem, that government actually goes for higher spending, particularly in social sector, because social sector expenditures on health, education, etc., actually goes to the poorer section of population, whose consumption propensity is higher than the richer section of population, and it would have larger multiplier impact, and it would help the economy. It would give the required demand boost to the economy, so that the economy recovers soon. As far as the Satyakita was mentioning about the employment situation. I don't believe in these CMIE numbers, to be frank. There are a lot of limitations. A lot of people have mentioned this, that CMIE based in unemployment numbers have their own limitations. However, at macro level, even if we take PLFS periodic labor force survey data of 2019-20 and apply the negative growth rates sector wise for major 8 sectors of the economy, then I was calculating in the year 2020-21, the unemployment rate would be at least double digit. It would be around 12 to 13%, and not around 6 to 7%. But even in before lockdown, the unemployment rate was around 5.8%, which is around 6%. On top of that, there has been a negative growth rate of around minus 7.5%. So a rough calculation would tell you that probably, even if we assume the labor productivity to remain constant, which increases every year, by the way, even if we assume that to remain constant, then your unemployment rate would be 5.8 plus 7.5, so around 13 to 14%. And since sectoral distribution of labor is little different, so it would be around, according to our calculation, around 12 to 12.5%. That is the unemployment situation which was prevailing. Probably PLFS data is yet to come, for the year 2021. So we would see that there are a lot of probably open unemployment rate may not be that high. However, lot of people would be there with zero income, employed with zero income. That category would be very high, because more than 50% of our workforce, total size of our workforce in India is around 43, 44 crores. Total size of the labor force is around 51 crores, and more than 50% of our workforce is basically self-employed. That is, they are all these small shopkeepers and auto drivers and taxi drivers and so on and so forth. Most of them are engaged in informal unorganized sector. So even if they open their shops, if there is no profit, then they don't earn any income. So employment with zero income, that category, already PLFS 1920 has shown for the last quarter, that is the first quarter of lockdown, that this I mean, if you consider this to be unemployment, then this category of unemployment has increased enormously. So including that, that is people employed with zero income plus open unemployment, it would go up to more than 12% in 2020-21, in my opinion. As far as inequality is concerned, uh, I think the root cause of this whole thing, whole debate, that whether our GDP data or growth data is reflecting the reality or not, why people are taking so much interest now and they were not taking earlier, etc., are coming. The root cause is basically this inequality. I was calculating, we don't have reliable data on consumption expenditure after 2011-12, but if we index it to the inflation rates, and in 2019-20 prices, according to 2011-12 consumption expenditure data, 80% of our urban households, their consumption expenditure is less than 23,000 per month, and for rural households it is less than 12,500 rupees or less per month for 80% of rural households. So that way the per capita consumption expenditure would be less than 6,000 rupees in urban India and less than 3,000 rupees in rural India for 80% of the households. Now, given this kind of inequality, and obviously we know that the burden of this lockdown has disproportionately affected the poorer section of population. Most of them are engaged in informal unorganized sector, and if there is a reduction of national income by, let's say, 7 to 8%, then probably the income which are earned by this 80% population, I am talking about the apart from the richest 20% population, their total income would be it may vary little bit, but according to my calculation it would be something around 30% of GDP. So 80% population earns 30% of GDP, and if that GDP shrinks by 7 to 8% or 10%, then and if this 30% of GDP which is earned by the 80% population, if that comes down drastically, then obviously the kind of misery we are witnessing in our society, that would not be matched with the GDP numbers or growth numbers, because 20% of the population, their income may not get affected that much. So that's my take on this. And as far as inflation Deepa was mentioning, I think it's very important to understand that whenever we talk about inflation, we don't distinguish between cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Now, this fiscal deficit raise or expansionary policy led inflation or monetization led inflation, etc., are demand pull inflation. They are not cost push inflation. But the inflation that we are witnessing today, as Deepa was rightly pointing out, that it's basically petroleum price led inflation or food price led inflation. Those are mostly cost push in nature and not demand pull in nature. So it has nothing, it doesn't have, in my opinion, any contradiction with expansionary fiscal policy. Under a situation of cost push inflation, if somebody argues that government should not go for expansionary fiscal policy because it could become even more inflationary, I disagree, because the problem today is that of aggregate demand. The consumption demand has come down as a result of fall in income. So under a demand constraint situation, if demand management policies are undertaken, it would not be inflationary, or at least it would not cause demand pull inflation, in my opinion. So
Okay.
I would probably rest my case for the time being here.
Right.
And
Thank you. I'm going
in
to
the
come
next
back to
round.
you. I'm going
Sure.
to come back to you once again in a little while on the third section, where we look at certain other issues, including issues relating to the political economy of the present situation. But I would like Professor Shatuki Rai to elaborate on several points that have been made both by Professor Dipa Sinha and by you, Professor Surajit Dash. The efficacy or otherwise of an expansionary fiscal policy, impact on inflation, demand pull, cost push. And he's also talked about the numbers which have come out from the CMIE, the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy. The reason why these numbers are coming out is because we don't have any other data. But he's also questioning whether the CMI data is actually underestimating the scale of the problem of unemployment, underemployment, what economists also call disguised unemployment, or those who are employed but with effectively zero income. So maybe you would like to elaborate on these points in greater detail, Professor Shatuki Roy.
Okay. So first of all, I would say that regarding the policies that you mentioned in your initial comments in the second round of discussion, Surajit has explained them. But what I would say that basically the point is most of these policies were targeted towards loans, providing loans and indirect credit provisions. And during a situation when 46% of the household are actually borrowing to survive, and you have a drastic cut in real income in the major segment of the society, there is a contraction in demand. So of course, the credit appetite of these small enterprises, micro enterprises, were pretty low. And so even if these provisions were made, they actually didn't contribute to the process of recovery. Now, this is reflected by the fact, as I said in my previous discussion, that the corporates, and I'm talking about the listed companies, non-financial companies, as I said, that their reserves and surplus have increased according to March 21 data by 15%. But that, if we see that what is the proportion of reserve and surplus that is being used to create new capacity, we'll find that not much has happened in this regard, because there are a lot of capacity which is actually underutilized. And even if the corporates have a lot of reserves and surpluses in their hand, they are not in a mood to expand their capacity, knowing fully the kind of depressing or slowing down or contraction of demand that is still prevailing in the economy. Now, the question that Surajit raised regarding CMI data, I'm not going into that, because if you use the same data and if you find that there is a contraction, you can question the extent of that contraction. And the only point where I use CMI data is basically measuring the monthly manufacturing employment. So the last figure that I said, about 40 million, which came to 30 million, 20 million April 2020, then 30 million in February 2021, and then again to 28 million is the high frequency data which is being provided by CMI. The rest of the propositions that I made are basically visible from PLFS. And the most important trend that we see, if we see the PLFS data 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, I'm talking about the annual figures. During the period when there was a stagnation in the economy, when the economy was slowing down because of the pandemic, it is also the period which shows a rise in labor force participation rate. Now, we need to explain this because the rise in the labor force participation rate in countries like India, and also to some extent, there was a rise in workforce participation as well. Now, how do we explain this? Because on the one hand, we need to see that which are the components where people are basically more additionally joining into the labor force, what contributed to the growth of this labor force participation rate. Now, the two major components which contributed to the growth of this labor force participation rate, one is the female labor force participation rate, which increased during this period of time, which is to some extent, people are saying, a reversal of the long-term trend. Of course, there were episodes where labor force participation rate for a short period for female increased, but largely it was declining in case of India due to mechanization of agriculture, due to the kind of jobs where women were first excluded and things like that. So these contributed to that thing. But now what we see that the female labor force participation rate has increased during this period of time. The other component which contributed to the labor force participation rate is basically older people above age 60. So older people are more and more joining the labor force to earn something in order to survive. Now, if we see the pattern of employment in the sense that if someone says that self-employment as a proportion to total employment has increased during this period of time. Now, if some says that people are more into business, they're doing something, we need to see that what kind of self-employment is increasing. And PLFS or NSSO makes a kind of categorization of self-employment where one is the owner, business owner and worker, and the other is helper in household enterprises. We will see, as Surojit has mentioned, that the helper in the household enterprises are the category that has expanded in self-employment that has additionally been created during this period and particularly in the rural areas. Now, this helper in household enterprises, most of them are unpaid. And if you see that the share of women in this helper category of unpaid labor is around 62%. So the major absorption and additional employment of women that is being reflected by increasing female workforce participation rate is because of what Surojit was mentioning, and that is being reflected in PLFS, that unpaid family labor, this is the component which has increased during this period of time. So I would suggest that so these are trends, these are really worrying trends, where you find that once again there is a reversal of employment from non-agriculture to agriculture, which is basically an increase of farming labor. And the other thing is that in case of, if you see in PLFS data, it is basically the unpaid family labor, that component has contributed more into the labor force participation rate. I'll end by mentioning one thing, because whether whatever questions you have about CMIE data or not, I'm not disagreeing that. But the point I'm making is that CMIE CPHS, which is Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, makes a categorization of self-employment. The first category is businessmen who are shop owners, factory owners, small office owners, and things like that. The second category is professional small enterprise, self-employed enterprises, which includes doctors, lawyers, and chartered accountants. The third category is non-professional self-employed enterprises, which includes cook, beautician, gym trainer, taxi operator, barber, gardener, plumber, security guard. Now, if we see that the component of the third category of self-employment that has continuously increasing, which is being reflected by PLFS as well as CMIE. The third category of non-professional self-employed enterprises, their share in total self-employment was around 62% in 2016. That has increased to 77% in 2020. And if you check the recent CMIE data, it suggests that it has already reached 80% of the total self-employment. So what has actually happened in this process is that precarity of the employment has increased. What Dipa has already mentioned, I will end by saying that this is a scenario which of course does not signal some kind of a healthy recovery. If someone says that it is K-shaped, I would say that India's growth trajectory from the beginning in the pre-pandemic period was also K-shaped. So you have to take a policy which basically favors the poor and inject demand in the economy by putting cash in their pockets so that they can have purchasing power. So the stagnation and the slowing down of the economy was already visible in the pre-pandemic scenario, and the pandemic actually accelerated the process. The fork of the K have become much more diverse during this process. Their distance increased. So the policies need to be taken basically to address this problem, where we can reduce the gap and actually reduce the inequality which is being generated in this whole process. So there I stop for the time.
1 minute. My mic is, yeah, okay. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Okay. दीपा जी, अभी जो सात्विकी जी और सुरजीत जी ने कहा, इस विषय के ऊपर आप हमारे जो चर्चा है इसको आगे ले जाइए। एक तो है महिलाओं के ऊपर क्या असर पड़ा, ये जो आर्थिक मंदी का समय महिलाओं के ऊपर क्या असर पड़ा, इस विषय के ऊपर सात्विकी जी थोड़ा बहुत कहा, आप और भी आगे बढ़ाइए हमारा चर्चा। साथ साथ इन्होंने कहा कि हम भारत सरकार खर्चा करने के लिए तैयार नहीं। क्यों तैयार नहीं है खर्चा करने के लिए? सब कुछ आप एक तरह से मांग के जो प्रॉब्लम है, डिमांड साइड जो प्रॉब्लम है, आप उसको सप्लाई साइड से कोशिश करें उसको बेहतर करने के लिए, ठीक करने के लिए। आप देख रहे हैं किस तरह से बड़े कॉर्पोरेट्स को आपने इसका टैक्स काट दिया, इसका टैक्स रेट जो था, कॉर्पोरेट इनकम टैक्स रेट्स, जिस तरह से इन जो बड़े कंपनियों के ऊपर जो आयकर का जो रेट था वो आपने काट दिया। तो अभी हम जब देखते हैं कि ये आर्थिक स्थिति की इतने एक नाजुक है, जैसे अभी सात्विकी जी ने कहा, प्रिकेरिटी ऑफ एम्प्लॉय ये तो बढ़ गया, और इसके बारे में आप भी हिंदी में थोड़ा बहुत हमारा चर्चा को आगे ले जाइए।
जी, तो पहले जो आपने पहला सवाल रखा मेरे सामने कि महिलाओं के स्थिति के बारे में, जो ये ब्रॉडर मुद्दा जिस पे हम बात कर रहे हैं उससे भी काफी जुड़ा हुआ है। जैसे शतकी जी ने अभी कहा कि जिस तरह से हम रोजगार का अगर आंकड़े देखें तो कुछ चीजों में ये भी लगता है कि बेरोजगारी घटी है, रोजगार बढ़ा है, जैसे कि महिलाओं के संदर्भ में। ये लेटेस्ट जो PLFS डेटा आया है वो ये दिखाता है कि हमारे देश में बहुत सालों से ये समस्या रही है कि जितने महिलाएं लेबर फोर्स में हैं, जो घर से बाहर मतलब जिन चीजों को हम काम के रूप में गिनते हैं, उसमें जितने महिलाएं आ रही है वो दर घटते हुआ आया है। अब ये महामारी के बाद जो डेटा आया है वो दिखा रहा है कि ज्यादा महिलाएं अभी काम के क्षेत्र में आई हैं। लेकिन जैसे शतकी जी ने कहा, ये अगर हम देखें कि ये महिलाएं कहाँ पे हैं जिनको दिखाया जा रहा है कि अब वो पहले काम नहीं करती थी और अभी काम आए, ये ज्यादातर उस कैटेगरी में आता है जो PLFS सर्वे में हम कहते हैं कि अनपेड हेल्पर इन हाउस होल्ड एंटरप्राइज। मतलब घर का कोई, आप वो बिजनेस भी हो सकता है या घर का काम जो है उसमें हेल्प करना बिना किसी वेतन का, इसमें हम देख रहे हैं कि बड़े हैं। और ये पहली बार नहीं है। 2004 का जो सर्वे आया था तब भी जब हमने देखा था कि 2 साल ड्राउट था और उसके बाद महिलाओं का लेबर फोर्स बढ़ा, तब भी ये डिस्ट्रेस ड्रिवन एम्प्लॉयमेंट होता है। मतलब हमारे जैसे देशों में अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट का दर, बेरोजगारी का दर हमेशा थोड़ा कम दिखता है, क्योंकि लोग बिना कुछ कमाए रह नहीं सकते। लोगों को ऐसा नहीं है कि हमारे पास ये अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट्स है या लोगों के पास इतना सेविंग है कि कुछ दिन वो लोग बिना कुछ किए जी सकते हैं। जीने के लिए लोगों को कुछ ना कुछ करना पड़ता है। तो इसीलिए जब बहुत इस तरह का डिस्ट्रेस का समय आता है, तब कुछ एम्प्लॉयमेंट जो दिखता है वो ऐसी एम्प्लॉयमेंट है जो डिस्ट्रेस एम्प्लॉयमेंट है, जो लोगों को, जैसे महिलाएं को घर से बाहर निकलना पड़ रहा है इवन इफ दे आर नॉट गेटिंग अ बेसिक इनकम। जैसे शहरी इलाकों में बहुत सारे हम लोगों को एग्जाम्पल मिल जाएंगे, जो घरेलू काम, जो डोमेस्टिक वर्क, घरों में जाके काम करती है महिलाएं। एक तरफ इस सेक्टर पर बहुत ज्यादा असर पड़ा क्योंकि लॉकडाउन हुआ था, लोगों ने काम वालों को रखना बंद कर दिया। दूसरी तरफ हम देखते हैं कि बहुत सारे महिलाएं जो पहले घर पे रहती थी या इस तरह के काम नहीं करती थी, अब क्योंकि घर में आमदनी घट गया है, ऐसा काम करने के लिए तैयार है, तो वो बाहर आई है और ये आंकड़ों में दिखता है। दूसरा क्षेत्र जहां पे महिलाएं काम पहले से करती हुई आई है, उसमें भी अगर हम महिलाओं का स्थिति देखें तो वहां पे भी थोड़ा स्थिति सही नहीं है। एंड द एग्जाम्पल आई वांट टू गिव हियर इज द हेल्थ सेक्टर। तो हेल्थ सेक्टर में 50% जो होते हैं एम्प्लॉइज, वो डॉक्टर नहीं है, वो नर्स और टेक्नीशियन वगैरह ये सब हैं, और इसमें महिलाएं सबसे ज्यादा होते हैं। और इसके साथ साथ अगर हम जोड़ ले आशा वर्कर, आंगनवाड़ी वर्कर जैसे महिलाएं जो ये पूरे महामारी के समय में काम कर रही थी, तो काफी महिलाएं थी जो काम भी कर रही थी, रिस्क भी ले रही थी, लेकिन इनका भी पेमेंट अगर हम लोग देख ले वो बहुत कम है। और ये पेमेंट का बात मैं इसलिए भी उठा रही हूँ टू रिलेट टू योर सेकेंड क्वेश्चन ऑन द स्पेंडिंग। तो एक तरफ तो ये काफी क्लियरली हमारे चर्चा से निकल के आया है कि बेरोजगारी, एक तरह की बेरोजगारी जो है वो बढ़ रही है, इन द सेंस कि अगर लोग काम कर भी रहे हैं, जैसे सुरोजित ने कहा, या तो उनको कोई पैसे नहीं मिल रहे हैं, काम कर रहे हैं आप लेकिन जीरो आमदनी, या आप ऐसे क्षेत्रों में काम कर रहे हैं जहां पे आमदनी बहुत कम है, या पहले जितने दिन रोजगार मिल रहा था उतना दिन रोजगार नहीं मिल रहा है अभी। और ये महिलाओं के मामले में और भी इंटेंसिव है। जब ये स्थिति है, जो दूसरे बात पे हम लोग बात किए हैं कि इसका मतलब क्या है कि लोगों के हाथों में खरीदने का क्षमता नहीं है, और आप जितना भी लोन फ्री में दिए जाइए, कोई भी बिजनेस वाला इन्वेस्ट तभी करेगा जब उसको लगेगा कि कोई खरीदने वाला है। और जो छोटे इंडस्ट्रीज है, बिजनेस है, किराना का दुकान है या कोई और छोटा मोटा खिलौना बेचने वाला दुकान है, उन लोगों को कहाँ से डिमांड मिल रहा है? उन लोगों को क्या दिख रहा है? उन लोगों को यही दिख रहा है कि अपने आसपास की लोग गांव वापस गए, अभी वापस शहर में आए, उनको काम नहीं मिल रहा है और वो लोग कुछ खरीदने के लिए तैयार नहीं। तो ये पूरा जो एमएसएमई के लिए क्रेडिट चीप में देना, स्ट्रीट वेंडर को 10,000 रुपए देना, इन सारे चीजों का असर बहुत लिमिटेड है अगर मांग नहीं बढ़ाया जाए। और ऐसे स्थिति में मांग कैसे बढ़ाया जा सकता है? मांग वैसे तभी बढ़ाया जा सकता है अगर सरकार खर्च करे। और ये क्यों है? वो इसलिए है क्योंकि सरकार ही एक ऐसा है जो बिना आमदनी भी खर्च कर सकता है। कोई भी अगर एक परिवार आप ले लो या किसी व्यक्ति को ले लो, तो आप बिना आमदनी बहुत ज्यादा खर्चा नहीं कर सकते, लेकिन सरकारें ये कर सकती हैं। और सरकारें जब ऐसे स्थिति में खर्च करती है तब पूरी आर्थिक वृद्धि होती है और सरकार को भी टैक्स फिर ज्यादा मिलेगी। अगर सरकार खर्च नहीं करेगी, कोई इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी होगा ही नहीं, तो सरकार को जो आमदनी मिलता है वो भी घटते जाएगा। लेकिन जो खर्च करती है सरकार, वो दो तरीके से हो सकता है। एक हो सकता है कि जो कमाई है उसको ही कम कर ले, जो हमारी सरकार कर रही है कि जो कॉर्पोरेट है, जो बड़े बड़े लोग हैं, उनका टैक्स आप कम कर लेंगे तो आपका कमाई कम हो जाएगा। लेकिन उनका टैक्स कम होने से आर्थिक वृद्धि नहीं होगा, क्योंकि वो लोग जो खर्चा करते हैं, जैसे अगर आप अंबानी के 1 करोड़ रुपए बचा लिए तो उससे बहुत ज्यादा फायदा नहीं है, क्योंकि वो 1 करोड़ वो इस देश में जो उत्पादन हो रही है उन चीजों पे खर्चा नहीं करते। लेकिन अगर आप जो 10 लाख आंगनबाड़ी आशा कार्यकर्ता है हमारे देश में, उनका आमदनी आप 2,000 महीने से बढ़ा के अगर 6,000 रुपए महीने आप बना देंगे, तो वो जो 4,000 रुपए अतिरिक्त मिलेगा उस आशा कार्यकर्ता को, वो खर्च करेगी अपने खाने पर, अपने बच्चों की पढ़ाई पर, कपड़ों पर, छोटे मोटे घर के सामान पर, जिससे मांग बढ़ता है, जिससे और आर्थिक वृद्धि भी होता है। तो खर्चा करना एक तो जरूरी है, और जैसे हमने देखा, बोला गया था कि जीडीपी के 10% खर्चा किया है, लेकिन जो लेटेस्ट आईएमएफ का डेटा है वो दिखाता है कि जीडीपी के 3.5% is what India the spending has been because in the COVID response, and this is on the lower side when you compare with other countries. It's below the average of emerging market economies as far as the fiscal spending goes. तो खर्चा तो कम है, और उस खर्चे में भी जो सही चीजों पे खर्च करना चाहिए वो ज्यादा खर्चा नहीं हुआ है। जो गरीबों के हाथ में पैसा जब जाएगा, जब ये सारे असंगठित क्षेत्र के वर्कर्स के बारे में हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं, इनके हाथ में जब पैसा जाएगा तब आर्थिक व्यवस्था में मांग बढ़ेगी और उससे एक रिवाइवल हो सकता है। इसमें हम अगर देखें खर्चा किस पर हुआ है, एक प्रधानमंत्री गरीब कल्याण अन्न योजना पे जरूर हुआ है, लेकिन वो भी हम लोग जान लें कि इट इज नॉट मतलब वो 1% ज्यादा जीडीपी का खर्चा हुआ है, लेकिन साथ ही साथ इट हैज ऑल्सो बीन अ टाइम रिकॉर्ड अगर किसी चीज पे हम लोगों का सही में हुआ है वो है फूड ग्रेन स्टॉक्स पे। पूरा ये महामारी के दौरान 80 मिलियन टन से ज्यादा फूड ग्रेन स्टॉक किसी भी समय में एफसीआई के गोडाउन में रहा है। तो अगर ये अनाज नहीं बांटते तो ये सारा अनाज सड़ता। इनफैक्ट और भी अनाज पड़ा हुआ है, जिनके पास राशन कार्ड नहीं है उनको भी देना चाहिए। लेकिन बाकी चीजों में, शिक्षा के क्षेत्र में, स्वास्थ्य के क्षेत्र में, पानी, सफाई, इन सारे क्षेत्रों में खर्चा रियल टर्म्स में घटा है। ये जो महामारी वाला साल है उसमें आंगनवाड़ी पे खर्चा घटा है, उसमें शिक्षा पे खर्चा जो है वो कम हुई है। और ये सारी खर्चा अगर हम लोग करेंगे तो हम ये सोचें कि पैसे किसके हाथ जाएगा। जब सरकार शिक्षा पे खर्चा करती है, नरेगा पे खर्चा करती है, स्वास्थ्य पे खर्चा करती है, तो गांव में या शहरों में जो असंगठित क्षेत्र में मजदूर हैं, जो आशा वर्कर है, आंगनवाड़ी वर्कर है, प्राइमरी स्कूल में जो शिक्षा मित्र है, ऐसे लोगों के हाथ में पैसा जाता है जो लोग खर्च करते हैं, जो वो पैसे पे नहीं बैठते हैं, खर्च करते हैं, जिससे जो पूरे इकोनॉमी में मांग बढ़ सकता है। साथ ही साथ इन खर्चा से और भी बहुत सारे फायदा है। लोग, बच्चों को पढ़ाई मिलेगी, स्वास्थ्य बढ़ेगी, ये सारी चीजें इकोनॉमी के लिए अच्छा है आगे जाते हुए भी। बस मैं 2-3 आंकड़े देना चाहती हूँ बंद करने से पहले, कि अगर हम इस साल का बजट देखें, फरवरी में जो बजट आया था, बहुत उम्मीद थी कि महामारी के बीच में बजट आ रहा है तो इससे कुछ, जैसे इन क्षेत्रों जिसके बारे में मैं बात कर रही हूँ उस पर बजट बढ़ेगी। हेडलाइन न्यूज बना था कि हेल्थ पे 129%, 139% इंक्रीज इन हेल्थ बजट। जब हमने डिटेल देखा, वो दिखाया गया उसमें कि बहुत बड़ा उसका हिस्सा जो हेल्थ में इंक्रीज इन बजट दिखा रहा था वो एक मिशन जल शक्ति के नाम पे था। और ये स्कीम था कि हर घर में पाइप पानी पहुंचेगा। अभी मैं चेक कर रही थी सितंबर तक कितना खर्चा हुआ। सितंबर तक आधा साल खत्म हो गया फाइनेंशियल ईयर, 50% तो कम से कम खर्चा होना चाहिए। जितना बजट उसके लिए एलोकेटेड है उसका सिर्फ मात्र 25% अभी तक खर्च किया गया है। आप एजुकेशन का बजट ले लीजिए, शिक्षा मंत्रालय का बजट सिर्फ 1/3 अब तक खर्चा हुआ है। मतलब एक तो बजट एलोकेशन कम हुआ है, उसके ऊपर जो खर्च भी किया गया है, जितना एलोकेट किया गया है वो भी खर्च नहीं किया। आखिरी पॉइंट ये है, जो आपने शुरू में कुछ हमें कोट सुनाया कि मंत्री, अलग अलग मंत्री लोग क्या कह रहे हैं, उसमें एक था कि ये रिकवरी बहुत सही सोच समझ से किया गया, पैसे फिजूल में खर्चा नहीं किया गया और डीबीटी दिया गया टारगेटेड, जिसको सबसे ज्यादा जरूरत है। डीबीटी क्या दिया गया? दूसरे लहर के बाद किसी को कोई पैसे नहीं दिए गए। इवन आशा वर्कर और गवर्नमेंट हॉस्पिटल में नर्सेस को जो थोड़ा बहुत इंसेंटिव पिछले साल दिया था वो भी नहीं दिया गया। पिछले साल दिया गया था, कितना हम लोग एक बार याद कर ले और सही में सोचे कि क्या इससे लोगों की जिंदगी में कितना फर्क पड़ा होगा। पिछले साल डीबीटी के नाम पे, कोरोना के नाम पे एक्स्ट्रा 500 रुपए 3 बार देना था जनधन अकाउंट वालों को, मतलब 1500, जो 1 साल से महामारी चल रहा है। और जो पेंशन मिलता है वृद्धा लोगों को और डिसेबल लोगों को और सिंगल वुमेन को, उनको 1000 रुपए एक्स्ट्रा दिए। बस बाकी जो पीएम किसान भी है, कोई एडिशनल नहीं दिया गया था। 6000 जो 3 किस्तों में देते हैं उनको एक ही टाइम पे दे दिया। तो ये जो पूरा बोला जा रहा है कि डीबीटी बहुत किया गया और इससे लोगों को फायदा हुआ, वो भी सही नहीं है। ये बहुत ही कम एक इंटरवेंशन था और एक बार पिछले साल मई में किया गया, मई जून में, उसके बाद डीबीटी नहीं हुआ है। एक ही इफेक्टिव प्रोग्राम रहा है, वो रहा है अनाज 5 किलो मुफ्त में जिनको राशन कार्ड है उनको बांटना। लेकिन उसमें भी कमियां हैं क्योंकि बहुत सारे लोग ऐसे हैं जिनके पास राशन कार्ड नहीं है। तो आई थिंक दिस होल थिंग ऑफ टारगेटेड spending is also something that we have to look at the numbers at. And overall, like the others said, the response has been really lacking because it has been a supply side response, whereas the problem is a demand side problem.
Thank you. Dhanyavad, Dipa ji. And let me bring in let's start the third section. And I'll have a brief fourth section as well in view of some of the questions that have come in. I'm going to ask both Surajit and Shatuki to elaborate on some of the points that have been already made. One is that far from increasing spending, the government has continued to try and find supply side solutions to essentially demand side problems. and continues to do so. What we are seeing is that we are following the same old neoliberal policies followed in the past. So have we learned any lessons? And if we haven't learned, have we acknowledged the structural fault lines in the Indian economy? I mean, are we trying to address the fundamental questions, including the question of precarity of living, poor spending on healthcare, on education, and essentially how the situation has deteriorated in the recent past, especially the last year and a half. And I'd like you to weave in to your reaction three questions that have come from the audience. And the first one is by Namritan Nbung. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. How do you invest to create jobs? Very fundamental, basic question. Then Himanshu Damle has pointed out that despite the failure of the macro fundamentals, certain businesses have reported higher profit, or have been able to survive, have been able to show some profitability, even if their margins have shrunk. So the question that would naturally arise is that what now? What are the kinds of fiscal policies that need to be followed in order to neutralize this base effect, which the question is asking, especially on the new threat that is being perceived of the new variant of the COVID virus, the Omicron. And the third question, which has also come from Jofin Mathai, and he's linked what is happening in India, what's happening in the world. And his question is, how does the imperative for meaningful recovery and the nature of sector-wise recovery relate to the demands of global competitiveness? And what are the kinds of the demands that are being placed on India in the global scheme of things, and those who continue to support the need for a free market economic system? So these are some questions, three questions have come. There's a fourth question that has come from Bharat Raju. And so the fourth and the last part, we look a little bit at the political economy of the problem. So let me start with you, Surajit.
I don't know whether I would be able to do justice to all the questions or not, but let me begin by what Dipa was talking about. And you asked one question that why the government is not spending. In India, the total government expenditure, including central government and state government and the local bodies, is around 26% of GDP. Out of this expenditure, around 55% of the total expenditure is spent by the state governments and local bodies. I mean, local bodies spend very less, but basically, and central government spends only 45%, I mean, less than 50% of the total expenditure. Now, the situation is that there has been huge revenue shortfall. Because of this revenue shortfall, expenditure, although expenditure has not gone up as a proportion of GDP, in fact, it has come down as a proportion of GDP a little bit. In the last budget, which Dipa was mentioning in February, it has been released. That shows the revised estimate of the year 2020-21, which shows the fiscal deficit would be something around 9.5%, more than 9% of GDP for the central government alone. State government figures are yet to come, but including, I mean, for the state governments also, the fiscal deficit would be more than 4% of GDP, because GDP has shrunk. So the denominator has become smaller, and given any numerator, if denominator shrinks, then the ratio goes up. So that way, combining central and state government, the fiscal deficit of 2020-21 is likely to be more than 14% of GDP, which is quite high. Now, this government is, that is why probably government is showing some kind of desperation for selling all these public sector units, in spite of a lot of protests and oppositions. I mean, they need some money to finance this huge, large fiscal deficit, and they have no clue how to do it. So this is the crux of the problem, which I think the public economists, I mean the government economists are facing. Now here Dipa was arguing, and quite rightly I completely agree with her, that there are two options. One, that since you have less revenue, you spend less, and the recovery would be slower, and future revenue streams would also suffer, so future expenditures would also be less, and as a result of that the recovery would be even slower. The other option is that you incur larger fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP today, go for expansionary fiscal policy, give a boost to the economy, inject extra demand as per the requirement. Let the recovery take place as soon as possible. Your future revenue stream would be, stronger, and as a result of that, your future the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP would all automatically come down. So I think the second option is better, and that is why probably demand side economists have to be given a patient hearing. And how to finance this huge fiscal deficit? Uh, my suggestion is that I was just checking the RBI website. As on 5th November, the stock of foreign exchange reserve with the Reserve Bank of India is $640 billion, which is equivalent to 47 lakh crore rupees, which is around 24% of our GDP, which has already been monetized. While accumulating this stock in order to maintain this exchange rate, or in order to manage the exchange rate, the RBI, while accumulating this huge stock of foreign exchange, they supplied domestic currency while buying these foreign exchange from the foreign exchange market. So it is already monetized, it is sitting idle in Reserve Bank of India. The average rate of return on this huge stock of foreign exchange reserve, 24% of GDP amount of foreign exchange reserve, is merely less than 2%, is little above 1% per annum is the rate of return. So government can always use part of this money, or government can always borrow part of this money from the Reserve Bank of India and pay Reserve Bank of India some 2% interest rate at a discounted rate, and they can spend liberally under this crisis in order to ensure faster recovery. And also, since according to our constitutional arrangement, since the larger expenditure responsibilities are lying with the state governments, enough money should be transferred to the state governments so that they are enabled to spend liberally. As opposed to that, what we are witnessing is the central government, because of its revenue shortfall, it is not in a position to pay the states this GST compensation. As a result of already GST revenue has fallen because of less consumption and less income of people, less purchasing power of people. As a result of that, state governments are also facing huge revenue shortfall and lower transfer than before, including this GST compensation transfer. So state finance is also in extremely tight situation. They are not in a position. All major subjects, social sector, particularly health, agriculture, everything is state subject. There could be one or two central sector schemes, but 80 to 90% of the expenditures on these sectors are spent by the state governments, not by the central governments. So state governments have to be given more powers, spending power, spending capacity, in order to ensure faster recovery, as well as in order to address this humanitarian crisis that we are experiencing today. And okay, sorry, and regarding these questions, I think how to create jobs, how to reach near full employment situation, etc. Even before pandemic, in 2019-20, the growth rate of our manufacturing sector was negative. The growth rate of investment in constant price was negative, and the overall GDP growth rate was coming down continuously. It reached below around 4%, GVA was growth rate was 3.8% if I remember correctly, and the GDP growth rate was around 4.2% overall. So that was decelerating. Credit deposit ratio was continuously falling. Investment GDP ratio in the economy was falling. So there was overall demand depressing situation. Under a demand constraint situation, if you have unemployment and unutilized capacity in the economy, then you have to inject demand through expansionary fiscal policy in order to reach if not full employment, at least near full employment situation. And free market economy and global integration, I think until and unless some major change takes place, this is the rule of the game. And no economy in today's world can be completely, de-linked with the rest of the world. So we have to remain integrated. We have to, and it is not a planned economy. Of course, the role of planning has been undermined, but the lacuna is quite visible, quite obvious. So the role of planning is extremely important, but at the same time, it is a mixed economy. Our government expenditure to GDP ratio is only 1/4 as compared to, let's say, European countries, where the government expenditure to GDP ratio is almost half, 45 to 50%. So the presence of government in this part of the world is extremely low as compared to the developed Europe, etc. And we have to depend 75% of our rest of the economy is basically non-government, in that sense private, you may say. So it's a mixed economy, and here I mean we have to, the planning must incorporate not only the government expenditures, but also the how to divert private investment in strategic manner, so that where employment, more employment in or labor intensive sectors get more growth, so that the existing labor force gets absorbed, and we can reach to if not full employment, but at least near full employment situation, or at least we can reduce the unemployment rate. Because if I agree, MGNREGS under crisis can give the minimum wage. That is also not minimum wage, 202 rupees. Our minimum wage is 350 rupees per day per head for agricultural laborers. It is even much lower than that. But whatever, it is almost like unemployment benefit, but this is not meaningful employment in any manner. So to create more jobs, more meaningful employment, we have to, under a market mixed economy, we have to have that kind of planning, so that profitable opportunity is created not only for the big businessmen and as Satyakida was pointing out, some favored industrialists, but in general in the economy, for all small medium scale entrepreneurs and also self-employed people, for everybody, so that the economy can grow, the investment becomes profitable, and the employment gets generated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Surajit. I'm going to get back to you after a little while with a few brief comments and our closing remarks. But let me first ask Professor Satyaki Roy to elaborate on some of the points that have been made by Surajit. And maybe you would also like to talk a little bit about the question that was raised by Jofin Matai. What is happening in India vis-a-vis what's happening in the rest of the world? And I must tell you, Surajit, you are, I think the questioners will be able to tell you, but I think you did do a good job in responding to the questions that were raised. Please, over to you now, Professor Satyaki Roy.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the first question, I think Surajit has adequately elaborated what needs to be done. And also earlier, Dipa has explained that why do we need an expansionary fiscal policy, a demand kind of response, rather than resorting to supply side responses. But one thing I would say particularly, that this is basically a position where we believe that if you give loans, you give tax offs to corporates, they would invest more. Now, this is basically assuming that a private capitalist is basically committed to increase the investment capacity of the economy. That is his responsibility. And if you give tax offs or you give certain subsidies, then the corporate would invest more. But as I said earlier, it has not happened. It is not going to happen because primarily any private capitalist, of course, invests money to get more profit rather than taking the responsibility of increasing the investment level of the economy as a whole to resolve the macroeconomic problem. What needs to be done by the state, which basically tries to function as a kind of a collective concern for the economy as a whole, they should take the responsibility to increase investment in sectors like infrastructure, like agriculture, like social sector, which is much more employment intensive. And as both Surajit and Dipa has mentioned, that there should be a direct injection of money, which can increase demand for immediately when the economy is basically slowing down in an abnormal situation. I would more focus on the second question, which is basically that how we vis-a-vis the global market and the competitiveness of Indian industries in a situation of recovery, how do we see that? First of all, I would say that in countries like India, which is low medium country according to the World Bank categorization also, and their studies have suggested that most of the developing countries, they basically grow their industries on the basis of domestic demand, and the advanced economies, their growth of industries depend upon global competitiveness. So relying more on exports, relying more on global production network, as it is often been advocated, that is not also the trajectory that India should take. I'm not saying that I'm against any kind of exports or global integration, but that cannot be the main focus of our industrial growth and recovery. Because first of all, even before the pandemic, there was a tendency of rebalancing of growth, particularly in major economies. After the lockdown, now the question is, as we know, that deglobalization is becoming one of the trends where everyone is trying to restore their economy rather than providing demand to other economies. So the possibility of relying on exports and on the basis of that you try to recover, that scenario is, I don't think, is very, very exciting. The other thing regarding integration to global production network, because many people argue that when you are globally integrated, better rely on labor intensive industries which create more employment. And if you can get integrated with the global production network, then you can increase your employment and also enhance growth. I would say that that has not happened neither in case of India nor in any of the developing countries in the recent period. Because if you see in case of India, what has happened, the major investments that have taken place by the foreign players are not in sectors like garments, leather, footwear, furniture. These are not the sectors where investment has been made. Actually, the major integration has taken place on relatively capital intensive industries, which are basically chemicals, motor vehicles, and you can say transport equipment. These are the segments where the major foreign investment has taken place. And the reason being that in advanced economies, when you have enough supply of capital because of the financialization, where the elasticity of substitution is relatively high, where you can easily substitute labor by capital, most of the industries went for capital intensive technology. It is only those segments where the substitution level is low or the possibility of substitution labor by capital is low. These are the industries which are relocated in the developing economies. And those industries are labor intensive according to advanced economy standards, but they are capital intensive according to Indian standards. So even if some investment came in these segments, these are not the sectors which generated enough employment as it was expected. So what I would briefly say that, of course, we need to see what possibilities are there to enhance our exports, but we cannot rely on exports and global production network as the policy focus in order to recover our economy. What we have to essentially do is to increase domestic demand, increase our capabilities, and more you can increase your share in the global market, also depending upon how complex commodities you were able to produce. We are still relying on primary commodities. Some exports have increased, their share has increased in case of light engineering, but largely it is basically primary commodities on which we are relying. So even if we think of a recovery with global integration and increase our competitiveness, we are far behind what is required even to become competitive in labor-intensive segments as well. Here I stop.
Thank you so much, Professor Shattuki Roy. I think our questioners should be satisfied with the responses. दीपा जी, मैं आपके पास आ रहा हूँ और आपके साथ ये एक विषय के ऊपर जो अध्यापक सात्विकी जी और सुरजीत जी ने बताया, इस विषय के ऊपर आप और भी विस्तार से कुछ कहिए, क्योंकि यहाँ से हमारा जो आखिरी जो हिस्सा है हमारे जो चर्चा के ऊपर, जो उसमें हम थोड़ा बहुत राजनीति ले आने चाहते हैं और उसमें आपका राय भी हम लेंगे। ये है जो मनरेगा के बात किया, महात्मा गांधी जो राष्ट्रीय ग्रामीण क्षेत्र में जो रोजगार का जो गारंटी का जो प्रोग्राम है, आपको याद होगा प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी सत्ता में आने के बाद उन्होंने हमारे लोकसभा में सांसद में खड़ा होकर कहा कि ये जो मनरेगा है ये कांग्रेस सरकार का असफलता का प्रतीक, उन्होंने कहा। आज हम देख रहे हैं कि ये महामारी के बाद, ये आर्थिक संकट के बाद किस तरह से केंद्र सरकार, भारत सरकार ये मनरेगा कार्यक्रम इसके ऊपर ज्यादा निर्भर कर रहा है और उनका बजट में जितने उन्होंने पैसा दिया उससे बहुत ज्यादा उसका खर्च पूरा कर रहा है और करना भी चाहिए और भी हो रहा है। तो यहाँ से आपका राय और अभी जो सूरजीत जी और सात्विकी जी जो कहा इस विषय के ऊपर, और भी अगर आप कुछ कहने चाहते हैं जरूर कीजिए, जरूर कहिए।
जी धन्यवाद। तो पहले नरेगा का बात, जैसे आपने कहा, इट्स monument to previous government's failure जो है, that has been one of the saviors, lifelines through this pandemic period। और हमने जरूर ये देखा कि पिछले साल नरेगा पर 1,10,000 करोड़ रुपए खर्च किया गया था, जो बहुत ही अच्छा है। इनफैक्ट डिमांड और भी ज्यादा था, काफी वेजेस अनपेड भी रह गए जो इस साल दिया जा रहा है, और इस साल का बजट भी खत्म हो गया है, लेकिन डिमांड काम का और भी है, जो वापस वही चीज दिखाता है जिसके बारे में हम बात कर रहे हैं कि काम की मांग है, और अगर लोगों के को काम देंगे और उनके हाथ में वेतन जाएगा तो जो इकोनॉमी में मांग की कमी है उसको भी थोड़ा बहुत हम लोग कम कर सकते हैं। इट्स वेरी, एंड मनरेगा काइंड ऑफ प्रोग्राम्स आर वेरी गुड in this regard to spend on, like Surajit also talked about. In fact, we should even be thinking about urban employment schemes. One of the things that the pandemic exposed is the precarity of the urban labor as well, and the urban poor. And we don't have any employment programs for urban poor. We don't have a unemployment benefit scheme either. So one kind of program which is very good to invest in times like this is the Manrega, which creates work and therefore creates demand. At the same time, it creates some assets in rural areas and so on. एक और प्रोग्राम जिसको बंद करने का कोशिश किया था, ये सरकार जब नया आया था, कैश ट्रांसफर से रिप्लेस करने का कोशिश किया था, PDS, that was the other program that has really delivered in these last 2 years. Without going much more into detail, so जैसे सब लोग कह रहे हैं, हम लोग शुरू से कि अभी हमारे आर्थिक व्यवस्था में जो मांग की कमी है उसको पूरा करने, उसको ठीक करने के लिए सरकार को खर्च करने की जरूरत है. Since we are kind of wrapping up and talking about what needs to be done, I would like to say that this something that everybody has been kind of pointing at, that जिस तरह के आर्थिक नीति अभी हम लोग देख रहे हैं वो कोई नया नहीं है. मतलब कोविड के चलते इस तरह के आर्थिक नीति नहीं आया, लेकिन जो उम्मीद था कि कोविड के चलते पिछले 20-30 साल से जो गड़बड़ियां हो रही थी उस पर वापस हम थोड़ा सोचेंगे और हमारा रास्ता थोड़ा ठीक करने का कोशिश करेंगे, वो लग रहा है नहीं होगा. So the neoliberal kind of policies, completely free market oriented, which are biased towards finance capital, which is something we've been seeing across the world, continues post the pandemic as well. Whereas the pandemic and the crisis that it has brought in should actually be seen as an opportunity to question the very basis of this kind of an economic model. And people have been talking about a new deal, which is not just a green new deal, but a multicolored new deal. Many people have been writing about a rainbow new deal, कि जो आगे चलते हुए जिस रास्ते में हम जाएंगे तब हम पूरे तरीके से आर्थिक नीति को ही रीथिंक करें, ताकि वो एनवायरमेंटली फ्रेंडली भी हो, that it takes care of water issues of carbon emission, issues of inequality between classes, inequality between rural and urban, between men and women, who are the left out groups, who are the marginalized communities, Dalits, Adivasis in our country, their access to resources, कि ये सारे सवाल जो हम लोग आर्थिक नीति की बात जब करते हैं जो नहीं उठाते हैं, इनको सेंटर में रख के अगर आर्थिक नीति बनाएंगे तो वो किस तरह की आर्थिक नीति होगी. So where there is inequality, where there is climate change taken into concern, and the last issue which I spoke about earlier also, the whole issue of the care economy. कि स्वास्थ्य, शिक्षा, we have an aging population, so soon we will need care of old people. इन सब चीजों के लिए क्या चाहिए? These are again sectors which are labor intensive. So there are of course the labor intensive manufacturing, but there's the entire care economy which is manufacturing. आप ये जो देखभाल जो है उसमें ह्यूमन एलिमेंट हमेशा रहेगा जिससे जॉब्स क्रिएट हो सकते हैं. सो आई रियली इन टर्म्स ऑफ लुकिंग फॉरवर्ड थिंग वुड बी टू question the entire basis of our economic policy and think of how do we rethink this completely.
Dhanyavad. Thank you so much, Dipa ji. You've touched on a number of issues and they are very, very important. जो बुजुर्ग व्यक्ति के लिए, जो हमारे देखभाल के लिए और हमें बहुत कुछ करना चाहिए. आपने हमारे चर्चा में पहला बार आपने ये क्लाइमेट चेंज यानी कि जलवायु परिवर्तन का विषय भी आपने लाया और ये पर्यावरण का जो एक संकट और समस्या हम देख रहे थे और हमने देखा लॉकडाउन के समय कैसे परिवर्तन के ऊपर क्या असर पड़ा और लॉकडाउन जब खोल दिया उसका क्या असर पड़ा. और this is the last and final part of our discussion and I'll request all the three speakers to give very brief and concise remarks and let these also be your closing remarks. I first want to tell you that one Mr. Vishal Bhatnagar has Mr. Vishal Bhatnagar, who is known to me, has complimented you, said all you have been very knowledgeable, and Professor Surajit Das in particular, your statistics were eye-opening for Vishal Bhatnagar. Let me here bring in the comment that was made by Bharat Raju Kyar, and we move a little bit into the political economy of our crisis. He says, Mr. Narendra Modi, our Prime Minister, is moving inch by inch towards a Congress Mukt Bharat. But he's certainly, as he points out, not talking anymore about the $5 trillion US economy. Just as he's not talking about Notebandi. There is a speaker, a questioner, Uday Vardhane, who is saying, unemployment rate is very high. What are the chances some job vacancies in the coming year? So this is a concern we see everywhere. At the same time, we see certain kind of a gut reaction happening. The Bharatiya Janata Party does badly in the bipolls. Suddenly, petrol prices come down, diesel prices come down. On Guru Nanak Dev's birth anniversary, the Prime Minister decide that now they're abrogating the 3 controversial farm laws. And that too, he says, because of his failure to explain to a section of the agitating farmers the real intent behind the reforms. He's not saying that the laws were wrong, but as we talk, those laws have been abrogated. There was no discussion in Parliament on the subject. So I'd like all 3 of you to give your closing remarks, and let me just reverse the order. दीपा जी, मैं पहले आपसे शुरू कर रहा हूं, इसके बाद मैं साथिकी जी के पास जाऊंगा और उसके बाद सुरजीत जी के पास जाऊंगा. आप संक्षिप्त में आपका जो कहना है, हमारा वक्त कम है, इसलिए let me take your closing remarks now.
Well, it's a very complex question that you have asked. I think I'll just, in fact, reverse the question a bit and say, so what is the opposition doing? जो आपने कहा और पिछले 2 घंटे से हम लोग जो facts बात कर रहे हैं और इसमें बहुत ज्यादा मुझे लगता है डिबेट नहीं है. ये सबको दिख रहा है, particularly after the pandemic, की बेरोजगारी है, दाम बढ़ रहे हैं. There was a video just 2 days back, I think in Gujarat, एक कोई क्लर्क का पोजीशन निकला था और इतने हजारों में लोग आ गए कि लाठीचार्ज होने लगा. And this has also become a regular feature in various parts of the country. And there are many vacancies in government jobs and so on. I think it is the responsibility, but of course there is the whole political question of how is it that the present dispensation continues to get the kind of support it does. maybe we should also look into asking whose responsibility it is to keep these issues alive. Demonetization पर अब बात क्यों नहीं होती, GST पर बात क्यों नहीं होती, महामारी पर भी बात नहीं हो रहा है. How we forgotten the first wave, the second wave, the issues with the oxygen supply, the issues with the hospital beds. We need to continue. I think the questioning is not happening as much as it needs to. These kind of programs are of course useful, but we need much more of putting out the data, putting out the information. It is an information age, and so वो missing बिल्कुल है. And of course, in this again we can talk about the political economy of the media and so on. लेकिन I mean that's what I would like to say as far as the political context.
Roy, if you can give your brief comments, and these are your closing remarks on what we've discussed and on the political economy or what's been going on, some of your comments on some of the observations I made, please.
See, what I would say, first of all, that neoliberalism faces a kind of a conflict in the sense that most of it is not about India, but most of the other countries who are pursuing these kind of policies. Their policies, their results are basically hurting the larger section of the population. And you are basically adhering to such policies which reduces the real income of the poor. As we discussed earlier, the real earnings of the regular salaried workers that has declined by 7.6%, and for self-employed people there it has declined by 26.4%. So there is a sharp decline in the real earnings of the larger section of the population. The problem is that the governments need votes of people in order to be elected. They can't be elected by multinational corporations or only by Ambani's, Adani's, or the big corporates who actually benefited in this whole process, whose wealth have increased by 35% during this period of time. So they are supposed to respond beyond the point to at least resolve some of the issues. Otherwise, their political position becomes destabilized. So one may think that because of the farmers' protest and other kinds of responses that people are on the streets, and so there was some response on the part of the government. But during this period, we see also that many of the governments have turned to more authoritarian policies. We should not forget that during this period of lockdown, we see that the labor reforms bill was passed in the parliament, which actually increases the provision of working hours for workers, as well as the provisions excludes a part of the workers from the minimum wage provisions and things like that. It is also the period when CAA was actually tried to be pushed forward. So what I'm saying that the government is trying to, or it is not about India only, in several parts of the world, when people are facing a crisis, they are trying to balance these protests and these reactions in two ways. One is take resort to more authoritarian kind of stances. So introduce policies which actually reduce the rights of people, which were earlier existing, and on the other hand, also try to respond to some of the demands of the people. Otherwise, the political establishment faces destabilization. So here I will stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Shattuki Roy. Let's have your closing remarks, Professor Surajit Das.
Yes, I think, I mean, we spend, Dipa was probably mentioning that including water supply and sanitation on health, our total government expenditure is 1.3% of GDP, including central government and state government expenditure. And excluding water supply and sanitation, it would be less than 1% of GDP, which is a matter of shame. I have looked at the world data. There would be hardly 10 countries in the world where government expenditure as proportion of GDP on health is lower than that, and our out-of-pocket expenditure on health is one of the highest in the whole world. So, I mean, I think in National Common Minimum Program in 2004, we discussed of increasing the health expenditure to 3% of GDP and so on. But it was then also it was less than 1%. Now also it is less than 1%. So this has to be increased substantially immediately, in my opinion, and it has got lot of multiplier effects. That if government spends more money on health, then out of pocket expenditure would come down. It's like social wage, and also automatic targeting would take place, because poorer section of population avails government health facilities more, and it is absolutely absolute need of the hour given this pandemic situation and health crisis in the country. Now, it is not only health, even MGNREGS, this employment of last resort program, as Dipa was mentioning, it must be expanded to the urban areas as well, because urban unemployment has actually gone up. I mean, both rural and urban have gone up, but urban unemployment has increased at a higher rate as compared to the rural unemployment. I mean, from whatever little data that we have got till now, that shows that. So urban employment guarantee scheme is absolute need of the hour, and the wage rate under this also should be enhanced to the at least minimum wage rate of the agricultural laborer in the rural areas and industrial workers in the urban areas, which are roughly 350 rupees per day and 450 rupees per day, from 202 rupees, which is the present current average wage rate under MGNREGS. So these are absolutely essential, immediate need. Now, I mean, we know that social sector gaps are huge in this part of the world. If we have to increase the expenditure, government expenditure substantially in these, capital expenditure of government is also very low in this country. That also has to be enhanced when private investment is not adequate in order to absorb the existing labor force. Then government investment has to complement it in order to ensure near full employment situation. That also has to be enhanced. So if we have to enhance all these things, then we need more tax revenue also. Now, here comes the question. Sorry.
Yes, please. I'll request you to quickly conclude your comments.
Yeah, maybe within 1 minute.
Okay,
So
sure.
yeah, so tax GDP ratio has to be enhanced, which is extremely low. Our combined tax GDP ratio is just 16 to 17% of GDP. So if it has to be increased, our tax rates, by the way, both direct tax rates as well as indirect tax rates are not low in international standard. Therefore, in order to increase this tax revenue, of course our tax base is low, but there is major scope of enhancing the tax compliance by increasing the tax information network of the government, by increasing the efficiency of tax collecting authority, and by reducing the degree of corruption. So these three are absolutely important. And one more thing, since inequality is very high, Dipa and Thakurta both were telling, I think it is extremely important to have some kind of wealth tax for the super rich, maybe after the exemption limit of 100 crore rupees. Those who owns wealth more than 100 crore rupees, there should be some tax at some minimum tax rate on that wealth. And also property inheritance tax, that is absolutely not there in our country, but it is there in almost all entire developed world, and it is absolutely, I think, justified to have some property inheritance tax, again after I mean fairly large exemption limit. So for the I mean those who are really rich, their sons and daughters would inherit the property absolutely free of cost, without paying a single penny to the government. In this kind of glaring inequality, situation of glaring inequality is probably not fair. So I would argue for these things in order to enhance tax revenue, which would increase the fiscal space of government to spend more money on the social sector, particularly where the areas where it is required, like health and employment and so on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Surajit Das. Sorry to cut you off. We are kind of about 4 minutes above our time limit. I don't want to even attempt to summarize this discussion, which has been very wide-ranging, very interesting. I would urge everybody who's been hearing it and hearing the program and hearing the three of you talk, please share it widely on the social media, because I think this kind of discussion often does not take place in much of the mainstream media. I also want to alert you that there are 3 more discussions that are going to take place on Friday, the 3rd of December, Monday, the 6th of December, and Friday, the 10th of December, at the same time as today, that is 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Let me thank once again Professor Shurojit Das, Professor Shatuki Roy, Professor Dipa Sinha, and on behalf I thank the CFA, the Center for Financial Accountability, Anirban and Ashish in particular, and also Suranya of NewsClick for putting together this discussion. Thank you very much. This is Paranjoy Guha Thakurta signing off. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.